one of the things you didn't mention, which would add, I would assume, to longevity and health, is stem cells, and under the word stem cell therapy, rather than the other word which I won't mention, which could be a bit more dangerous. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, which would add to all that you've said about longevity and the healthcare system.
I think I did briefly allude to stem cells along with gene therapy, because if you look at where we are now, there are some therapies out there that are clearly pro-aging, i.e. anti-aging rather, but they're not yet in the general market, and they're going to come. And I could list those for you, but it's a long list, so read it in the book if you've got the time. But the next step, the one that takes us beyond the maximal lifespan span of 110, which we could all live to actually, everyone in this room could live to that age, that takes us beyond Jeanne Calment's age and so forth, is dependent on gene therapy and stem cell therapy, as you put it, stem cells in a broad sense, and then other technologies that we just don't know about yet. But we've got to remember that we live in a world where knowledge doubles every 2 years. This is remarkable, all right? Now, a lot of that knowledge is absolute rubbish, but some of it is incredibly useful. And once knowledge is learnt, it can't be unlearnt. And I always cite the example of Germany after the war. Why was it that Germany recovered so quickly after total devastation? It's because the knowledge remained in Germany for how to make things and the technical skills and so forth. And that's all they needed, along with capital and hard work, to get back on their feet. We live in a world with much, much greater knowledge than the Germans had in 1945. And that knowledge is doubling every 2 years. So we can't see, you and I can't see around the corners of the future, but I can tell you that the shape of the future is really, really positive. And yes, you're right, you may be working for another 40 years. I hope you'll be working for 50 or 60 years if you like to work, because actually work and a sense of engagement will keep you alive much longer than if you go off and retire on a saga cruise somewhere. It really does, it really does. Stay interested, stay useful. Those two things are vital to longevity.
There is one sort of dark side, though, to that, and we're beginning to see questions raised, and that's where designer humans, designer babies. And this is what I mean, that with a lot of the good, that we will get some very major ethical issues that we're going to have to tackle over the next 10, 20 years. Already we know in China and Korea, they're beginning to work on this, and they have less of a moral compunction than we do of actually beginning to think about that. But I know it's a bit science fiction, but actually much of the technology that we're talking about and that's going to emerge in the next 10 years was stuff of science fiction just 10 years ago anyway. So I think alongside a lot of these changes, we are going to have a very good ethical reference system. That goes for things as all technology is going to bring that. You think about autonomous vehicles. Okay, so you're driving, you're going down the vehicle, your car's programmed to keep you going and also to protect you. But a young toddler runs out, dashes out in front of your vehicle, and the vehicle can't stop. It has to swerve. Does it save the toddler or does it save you? Technology can't come without some ethical considerations. So does your AI in your vehicle say, well, he's bought me, I'm going to save him? Or does it say, no, that toddler's obviously got more longevity, so I'm going to save the toddler and tough luck, mate, you're old and crumbly. So I think we do have to keep a mind to some of these ethical issues, and that's why the geopolitics is going to be important, and the type of world that we want to live in, and the type of political regime that we want to live in will be an influence, I think, on some of these decisions.
I know that you're about to release another book, Jim, which we look forward to, and I'm wondering, given some of the hits you've dropped tonight and back in April, how much you've studied the nutritional factors and the preventable diseases which Andrew alluded to earlier, and whether there's any business models out there which would encourage people just to eat better to extend their lives before you get to the drugs and the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, that's a very, very good question, and I have to say I applaud you because you do look a bit like Aubrey de Grey, who I'm sure you've been. I don't know if you know who Aubrey de Grey is, but the most best known person in the longevity space. Yes, the nutrition is extremely important, and at the back of the book there's a whole lifestyle section. Because let's face it, we all know tobacco is a killer. But not everyone knows that sugar is probably the biggest killer in the world, and that in every single bit of food that you eat that's processed, made in a factory or whatever, there is sugar, and we eat far too much of it, and that is the number one cause of both obesity and type 2 diabetes. And if I said to you that in 1984, 1% of the Chinese population had diabetes of any type, mostly type 1, and today it's 12% and rising, that's all down to Western lifestyles and diets, and particularly sugar. So my question at the back of the book is, why don't we tax sugar like tobacco is taxed? Because it causes more healthcare problems today than tobacco does. So why shouldn't it be taxed to the point where it becomes, as it was in the 17th and 18th century, a luxury that was rarely eaten or rarely taken, and now it's just abundant in everything. You can't avoid it, no matter almost what sort of life you lead. Now, in terms of investable business models, as an example, there's a man called Walter Longo, who's a famous US scientist in the longevity space, and he's just brought out a diet which you get through the mail, and it's a sort of combination of kale, cabbage, and beetroot chips and stuff like that. And it mimics, or it acts as a dietary restriction diet. And the only proven way at the moment in which you can absolutely know that you're going to extend your life, but it will feel like a very, very, very long life, is to eat 30% less on a daily basis. That's either called caloric restriction or dietary restriction. And Walter's tried to come up with this box. He's a very serious person, by the way, and it's just released this week, which will cost you, I think it's a few $100s a month for stuff that you could probably make yourself. But it's all, we love pre-packaged convenience food. So that sort of model, and the nutracyclical model, is going to be very, very important. It's a very good question, because if you want to get to 110 or 120, there are some very obvious things that you need to do, but we've written them down again, so just in case you've forgotten, at the back of the book, and with some recommended diets and other stuff like that. And so I hope that people will take attention at the back of the book as well as the front part of the book, which is the investment and cutting edge science type of it. Thanks for asking that question.
Do you think with the financial pressures on the NHS, for example, at the moment, that rather than having this kind of 0% tolerance on false positives, we're going to just get a slow improvement, slow sort of degrading of that threshold, whereby the NHS just accepts that over time a number of people will just slip through the net?
There's probably, if one's being honest, there is that acceptance already, and I think we're probably very different to many countries in actually pricing life. There's also an expectation as well, I think, from individuals about what they want, and I think that possibly is one of the other things we will have to handle with aging, is that there were many things that 40 years ago that we weren't expecting the NHS to pay for are now sort of mandatory. Oh, my knee's hurting, so give me a new knee. You can hobble for a bit. So where is the elected and the unelected bits? Where are we going to want to say target the actual payment and treatment, and what's actually nice to have, but that really should be covered by maybe an insurance contract. And I think some of that's very hard, and I think the consumers themselves will have to change the way they use the NHS as well. We're very unusual in Britain in that, unlike compared to Europe, where we always say their healthcare is so much better, it's much more generous. Most people pay to go to see their doctor. It might not be a very large amount of money, but you get better efficacy. That's why I think that things like apps and technology will change the way we deliver that. So I don't think we're yet fully there to actually answer many of these questions, but I do. That's why I keep coming back to the ethical and the moral side, is that we do need as a nation to grow up, and we just found it very hard to have that discussion as a country about what we really want our NHS to do. We just wanted to do everything, and that's patently impossible.
I mean, if I could just briefly add to that, one of the things about gene therapy is that it's going to be possible to edit out the monogenetic defects that cause so much misery to many thousands of people and are a huge cost to the NHS and the United States health systems, as well as many others. And those would be things like cystic fibrosis or Duchenne muscular dystrophy. sickle cell anemia, particularly prevalent in the United States. And although they're not diseases that have more than 200,000 patients, cumulatively they add up to a huge amount. So some of these therapies will cost, what, 100, 200, 300,000 pounds a year to maintain a patient for life. But by being able to edit out the specific gene, to knock it out, which is coming very soon, by the way, that will be a reduction in cost for the NHS. It will be very significant. And the second thing is that one of the key costs for the NHS and other health systems is the falling over of older people. Right, when they fall over and they break their bones, they bed block. We've heard about this before, but also their mortality rate is absolutely incredible post a fall. It's about a 50% mortality after a major fall in the year after the fall. And if we can do things using, you mentioned stem cells earlier on, to ward off osteoporosis and rheumatoid arthritis, brittle bone syndrome, which are the principal causes of falls, then you reduce a very major component of NHS expenditure. But the most important thing, of course, is people to take charge of their own lives and to eat better and to avoid obesity and to avoid type 2 diabetes. That would be the biggest reducer of NHS expenditure across the board.
And if they want to avoid the falls, start taking Pilates before you get to 60. Because actually, you know, this is a sort of slightly worrying for anybody who's thinking about approaching retirement, is that a lot of people end up in nursing care because they lose control of their bladders. And so strong core, good Pilates will actually stop that happening to you. I know, terrible thing for all you young people. I can see you all wincing.
We should write a lifestyle book together.
I think we should actually.
Yeah.
But you know, so strong core, Pilates, you know, eat well, and actually the amount of money that would be saved is quite phenomenal. And you'll have less embarrassment when you get into your 90s or whatever it's going to be. But so there is a lot we can do for ourselves, and that's self-help is very, very important part of this.
I think what hasn't been mentioned is what role will the blockchain technology play into healthcare, because it could be used to reduce the amount of mistakes that people have in terms of recorded information and misdiagnosis, for example.
Well, I think that's a question you should ask yourself, because you're the age where, and you're probably very interested in blockchain, that you could actually think out a way in which it could be applied. And I'm sure there are many other people who are thinking that. I doubt it's an area that we're expert in. In fact, I'm sure I'm not an expert in it. But of course the blockchain is going to be incredibly useful in speeding up the whole process. And I can see in 10 years' time there'll be an equivalent of Watson somewhere in the background or in the cloud, maybe not Watson, but something like that. And you walk into a doctor who will effectively be a front office receptionist, with the sort of soothing words that will tell you that either you're going to live or you're not going to live, but basically consult the
Left or
computer
right.
to do the triage, and it gets back to the point I'm making about professionals. Unless you're very, very specific in your profession and you're valued for a very specific human-led talent, you're going to be automated out. And you will be valued for your empathetic skills as opposed to your diagnosis skills, because there is no one on this planet as a doctor who will be better at identifying disease than the computers that are coming down the pike. Do you agree with that?
I do, but I think your blockchain point is very well made. If you look at the NHS, I think they wasted $2.5 billion on trying to implement a unified software system. That just didn't work. Anybody who's actually worked in IT and tried to do that, it's a real nightmare. So, but technology in that space now doesn't require the unified solution. You can have middleware solutions which brings together a disparate number of databases, which would bring enormous operational efficiencies and avoid the slippage that often happens in the NHS. And it would allow you to then link lots of different areas to as subject to confidentiality of information. So no, I think it's something that we will see significant savings over time as somebody tries to work out that sort of middleware solution, which blockchain could form part of.
Thank you. Thank you for an interesting talk. I'm working at a longevity startup, so it's all been interesting to me. On a related point, the UK now has quite a developed angel ecosystem because of EIS, SEIS, just a culture that's come up over the past decade or so. But the VC ecosystem seems comparatively underdeveloped. What could the government do to bring more cash into that space?
Yeah, I think a lot of that can be blamed on, say, pension funds. You know, I think when I started out, 30 years ago, there was a lot of investment in VC. Pension funds saw it as that, they had longer time horizons, they saw it as a natural area for them in which to invest. And they had bad experiences, to be honest. I think their experience and their knowledge and their ability to pick winners and losers, even the people who were actually maybe aggregating. So a lot of them stayed away from it. And I think one of the big challenges, that's what I was saying about vehicles at the moment, because as DC takes over from DB, DBs will not, defined benefit pension funds just won't go near VC because of the interest rate problem that Jim mentioned. Because interest rates are so low, on a mark-to-market basis, the deficits of pension funds are so high that they are so worried about loss that overwhelms their ability to look at making big returns. And so VC for them has got they just see the asymmetric skew in their eyes. It's always all downside risk, there's no real upside. And I think that's one of the big challenges, and that's why I would like to see an encouragement of some better long-term structural vehicles that maybe private investors or through DC plans, that there could be better ways of aggregating venture capital investment, because it is down to basically angel investing now, and there is that big gap, and it's just because the institutional space doesn't really have the way to actually make it attractive for the people who probably can afford to invest in it.
But also the tax-driven schemes you mentioned earlier on are just fantastic. There's no other country in the world, I think, that has such great tax incentives to invest in new businesses. And AIM-listed companies, as I understand it as well, don't attract capital gains tax as well. So we should rejoice in the blessings that we have. And remember that we are, by far, the biggest biotech centre in Europe, which is a great achievement. And I don't think that Brexit will derail that in any sense whatsoever. I'm very optimistic about the UK. And we are very interested to hear, Don, about your, Anthony is at the end of your startup as well.
Thank you to Jim and Andrew for a fantastic ride through. And we're hoping that we can repeat this in other sectors, etc. So any feedback that you have would be welcome. It's the first one that we're doing, and we'd love to hear from you in terms of how you found the format and whether there are other things that you'd like to hear about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.